Hey everyone, I just want to make a few comments on this week's module, and it's for Module 4, which is titled Where is Africa? And so you can see there's actually relatively little reading this week, just an article that I did called The Geography of African Philosophy, and a History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps episode as well. And I've put one of those on the reading slash listening list, but there are a number more listed in the module text itself. What I want to do with this week's module really is to kind of work through the questions in the areas that I put at the beginning of that Geography of African Philosophy article, and I list about 8 different kind of questions that could come up. Or that do come up when we're thinking about African philosophy as having a geography at all. And this of course is something that we don't often think of philosophy as having. I mean, it's kind of a weird juxtaposition. It's a little bit like talking about the literature of philosophy, or the politics of philosophy, or the sociology of philosophy. Sometimes people might think, well, that's not really philosophy at this point, is it? It's something else. And, I guess I would differ with that. I would say that these still are philosophical questions, even though they're also questions, that are relevant to other disciplines. We can overlap with those disciplines. I think it really is relevant to think about how our places matter in the development of what counts as philosophy, and what questions are considered legitimate, and all of that sort of thing. And so what I do in the module is really to kind of just go through a bunch of those different senses that one could have for what counts as African philosophy. And so you can read all of that. I'm not going to go through it all. I also pick up a question that I think for many people is kind of central for thinking about place, which is also really a question of time, I suppose. For many people, it's not African philosophy if there's any sense of being mixed up with the colonialist enterprise, and I can certainly understand why that would be, one thing that we would think of as being, pure or true African philosophy would be something that has not somehow been tainted by the colonial enterprise. And so for many people, going back prior to that is is a significant goal. I think it's worth noting that even though the colonialist enterprise was often genocidal, it was certainly violent, it was certainly extractive, it was brutal in so many different ways. It was an encounter, and there have been encounters since the beginning of time between groups of people. And so I think there's, imagining that there was a time in Africa when Africans only talked to other Africans is, at best a kind of, I'm not sure it's a really realistic sort of idea. If we go far enough back, of course, everyone comes out of Africa, but that's well in prehistory. That's well before, the kind of time periods we're talking about here. Once we start talking about Africa, we start talking about interactions between people, and many of those interactions were quite violent, even between African peoples themselves. Some of them were, even before colonialism, were encounters with people from outside of the continent, especially up and down what we call the Swahili coast, which is the east coast of Africa. Encounters with people from India that go way back, and so forth. And so, I think more useful is to think about how African philosophy has come into its own and found itself in the encounters that it has had, without ever dismissing the brutality and the undesirability of the colonialist project, and slavery and apartheid and all of those sorts of things. Those very much did warp what we think of as African philosophy, and so we should never downplay those in any way. But what it means is that, and this gets us back into a discussion with Pauline Huntangi from last week, what actually is going to count as African philosophy. And so I go through some of the things in this module where people have wanted to say, well, this is African philosophy. So we even see it in the history of philosophy without any gaps. We go back to ancient Egypt, and I think there's a very good case to be made that what happens in ancient Egypt is certainly philosophy and is certainly African. That podcast series also looks at Ethiopian thought, which is later than the ancient Egyptian. Some people would point to things like the Yoruba thought, Orisha, which people are often familiar with because it made its way to North America, to the Caribbean, in a variety of forms, and it became syncretic with a number of other religious traditions, integrated with them, alongside of them, all sorts of things like this. And so that's often of great interest to people who are part of the diaspora. And I mentioned Dogon thought as well, and there's many others that we could look at as well. And so it raises the question of how we think about traditional thought. And I think it's a little bit more complex than Huntanji would want us to believe. He would want to just say, well, no, it's not philosophy at all. And it seems to me that we need to take it seriously as philosophy, but not necessarily in the definition that we have in the contemporary, Anglophone world, certainly, as a set of texts where we find a set of arguments that interact with each other and argue for fairly abstract things and things of that nature. We have to rethink really what we mean by philosophy in order for us to understand how we can access that. And one thing we have to do is to think about philosophy not just as an intellectual and mental development of a set of concepts, but as forms of life, as ways that people have of understanding their worlds and expressing them as well. And so if we think of philosophy in those terms, we end up with something that I think has a much more ready door into the ancient worldviews. So I talk about some of that, and then finally I finish off this module by talking mostly about Hegel. And the reason I do that is, I use Hegel as a kind of example of European attitudes towards Africans that really kind of set the Western philosophical path for how Africa was going to be treated within the European mindset. So it's not African philosophy, but it has an effect on African philosophy, right? I mean, the fact that powerful empires that were colonizing Africa thought this way about Africans makes a difference as to how African thought itself gets warped, gets suppressed, gets translated, gets misunderstood, all of those sorts of things. And so it's really important for us to understand, that framework that has an effect on how we think about African philosophy. So that's really the path of this module. I'm looking forward to what you have to say in the discussion area. Have fun with this. This is really interesting and important material.